was the president and CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, appointed in 2018. Dan leads USMEF's implementation of marketing, trade service, and market access programs in key global markets to further increase U.S. red meat exports. Prior to USMEF, Dan spent 27 years in the meat industry with Swift & Company, now doing business as JBS based in Greeley, Colorado. His tenure at Swift started as a management trainee at the plant level before moving into commercial sales and eventually into international sales. As Senior Vice President of the International Division for Swift JBS from 2000 to 2010, he directed global beef and pork operations for the world's largest red meat company. Dan was an active member of USMEF for many years, including holding various volunteer positions and officer roles with the USMEF Executive Company from 2005 to 2007, culminating in him being named chairman in 2008. In 2019, Dan was appointed to USDA's Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee, and he currently serves as the board of the U.S. Agricultural Export Development Council, the International Meat Secretariat, and the University of Iowa Institute for International Business. A graduate of the University of Iowa, Dan was born and raised near Cherokee, Iowa, on a 1,000-acre grain farm, which included a 3,000-head cattle backgrounding operation.
Well, thank you, Maddie, and thank you to the Iowa Pork Producers Association for the invitation to speak with you today. I would say as I go through some slides, feel free to stop me. You don't have to wait till the end on questions. But if something's on your mind and you think of it and you want to ask a question, just go ahead and throw it at me during the presentation. So a little bit about USMEF. A lot of you may not be aware of who we are or what we do. We are a nonprofit trade association. We're based in Denver. We are basically a marketing organization, and we represent the global interests of the U.S. beef industry, pork industry, lamb industry, but we're really a diversified agricultural membership organization representing corn, soybeans, agribusiness. Farm bureaus are members of ours from all over the United States. So it's really a diversified membership that has an interest in maximizing the value of the exports of beef, pork, and lamb globally. So it's really, and I see a lot of faces in the room on the pork industry side that we partner very closely with the National Pork Board, National Pork Producers Council, the Iowa Department of Ag. I mean, the list goes on and on. Iowa corn, very, very deep roots in the state of Iowa. So, and which makes sense as the largest producer of pork in the U.S. So thank you for that. So as a member of MEF for almost 28 years, I can tell you that really this is the key. We're based in Denver. We have roughly 30 staff in Denver, but we have about 95 staff globally in 18, 19 regions around the world located here. The two strongholds for our staff is, of course, where the business is. The number one region being Asia, both North Asia as well as Southeast Asia. Our very first office was developed. We were founded in 1976. Our very first office was created in Tokyo in 1977. And you can kind of see it's evolved from there over time. Soon after Tokyo opened, we opened our Mexico City office in the 90s, Seoul in the 90s as well. And our most recent addition to the team is a gentleman in Jakarta, Indonesia. Indonesia and Malaysia are two spots that for both beef and pork that we see a lot of potential going forward. Actually, pork exports to Malaysia last year took a significant jump. And for those there's a lot of you very familiar with what goes on. The big constraint in Indonesia and Malaysia is not demand. There's plenty of demand. The problem is access, plant registrations in particular. So, that's an access, a government-to-government issue we're working on. And in fact, we had late last year, we had a USDA team get with the Indonesia team and trying to get 11 new plants on the approved list. So these are the sorts of things on the access side that we deal with. We are not a policy organization. We leave that to the experts at NPPC, experts at NCBA, but we do coordinate closely. A lot of times, NPPC, for example, will want to read out from our offices in a specific region about a specific issue. So that's really the extent on the policy side of our involvement. We're not lobbying in DC or anything like that. So let's talk about the markets. No shortage of concerns, issues. I'm starting with the negative. The other 22 or 3 slides are relatively positive. But I need to kind of set the stage. So we are setting records or close to records. It'll be a record in 2023 when we get December data for value of pork exports. But even with that, that's in the face of a lot of headwinds. I'm going to start with the exchange rate. The Asian currencies, for the most part, were pretty, the US dollar was pretty strong most of last year. So anytime you get a stronger dollar, I use the example of the Japanese yen, one of our largest markets. That's been hovering in a range of 140 to 148. I think we're at 148 today. That's 30% stronger than 3 years ago. So that means our products are 30% more expensive in yen terms in Japan. So that's a headwind, obviously. Now, the good news is that Japan is not self-sufficient. They need to import. So it's not like the business dries up, but you do suffer a bit when you have a 30% increase over 3 years. But I remember when the yen was under 100. I remember when the yen was above 150 decades ago, and they still buy. So I would say that short term, it's more of a disruption with exchange rate than long term because they still need to import, especially high quality products like we have. So the flip side of that is that not the entire world was strong on the US dollar. Latin America, for the most part, was not. Mexico in particular, the US dollar was actually weaker against the peso, which made our products more attractive in terms of price. So it works both ways. So I'll get more into Mexico later, but and it's not the only thing. This is one factor of many that impacts the marketplace. Inflation, global inflation. You guys know well about that. Spending power being inhibited because of higher exchange, interest rates, just the inflationary impact on goods in general. It's the same thing globally. And because most of our countries that we sell to are not nearly as efficient in their supply chain as the US is, they're probably disproportionately hit in terms of spending power. Now, the flip side of that is, I have another slide in a few minutes. I would argue that probably this will be a tailwind later this year because hopefully we're in a deflationary environment with interest rates coming down. And I think globally, that's sort of the mindset today that we'll see interest rates in a lot of these countries come down lower in the year, which will actually help us in the demand realm. China, I get the question a lot, well, what if the Chinese invade Taiwan? What happens to demand? To me, that's a ridiculous question because all bets are off. I mean, I think that, I've been asked questions about China when I was a trainee in 1983. I remember sitting in a meeting with senior staff in 1983 talking about China. So when you have the largest population in the world, in their case, the largest pig-producing country in the world, you're gonna always be talking about China. The reality is, my standpoint on China is they're a good customer, have been for several years now, since 2020, especially with the China Phase 1 deal in 2020, implemented in the Trump administration. We've, knock on wood, had very few major issues, like plant delistments or outright bans, had none of that. So the free market, so to speak, has worked pretty well. Now, I'm not saying we want to be overly dependent on China, not the case at all. One of our goals is to diversify as USMEF, as our stakeholders like Pork Board, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. The goal is to get as many customers in as many countries as possible so that we're not overly reliant on any one part of the world. But the reality is, in 2022, beef and pork, we exported $3.5 billion in beef and pork to China out of a total of about $19 billion. So that's a significant customer. Are we overly reliant on China? I'll give you a pork example. No. In 2020, when ASF hit in China, we had huge increases in pork exports to China. Everyone in the world had big exports to China. The European Union, the Brazilians, the Russians, us. But we probably had less of a share into China than the other majors. At the peak, we were about 25% of our exports in 2021, post-ASF in China. About 25% of our exports went to China. Anyone tell me in the room, Conley, you can't answer. Anyone tell me in the room, the EU, what their percentage of exports were to China in 2021? 65%. I would say that's too reliant. And we're going to get into it in a minute, but they have other issues going on, of which an over-reliance on China was one of the things that's sort of the downfall of what's going on in the EU today. Global uncertainty in other areas of the world, Ukraine, Gaza, the Gaza Strip, the Red Sea developments as of late are disruptive, not so much for our exports, but for the global supply chain, because most of what moves in the world, cargo-wise, is on vessel containers. So most of these vessels, depends on the route and the part of the world you're in, but they don't just go one spot and come back. They're making a loop. So a lot of these global routes somehow will be affected by what the disruptions in the Red Sea. Because the option, if you don't go through the Red Sea, is going down the Cape of South Africa, and if this goes on for any length of time, there will be some disruptions in supply chain, but nothing that we can't adjust to. Fed policy, financial, already kind of hit on that. So plenty of headwinds, plenty of things to worry about, but it's been this way for decades. So this is one of the positives. The growth projections globally, this is from the IMF's, the International Monetary Fund. They put out a really good preview of the coming year every December. You can see the global growth projections. 2022 is 3.5% GDP growth. 2023 was forecasted at 3 and came in at 3. And you can see we're just slightly lower in 2024 at 2.9. So globally, GDP is forecasted to hang in there pretty strong. But look at the right side, and maybe you can't see it in the back, but the United States projections are only 1.5% growth versus 2.1. The euro is worse, European area, 1.2 versus just moderate, barely had any growth last year. But look at the other regions. The Middle East and Central Asia, 3.4% growth. Emerging and developing Asia, this is ASEAN, Southeast Asia, 4.8% growth. Latin America and the Caribbean steady at 2.3, and Sub-Saharan Africa, 4%. Those four regions would basically sum up pretty much the emerging regions that we're focused on for U.S. pork and beef for that matter. So this is good news. The forecast, anyway, of the economic stability is pretty positive, relatively speaking, in a lot of our more price-sensitive future growth markets, which is, we'll get into that more in a minute. So what are the opportunities? There's a lot. I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner. I get the question a lot and have for years, but in the last few years, if there's one thing that stands out on what's driving exports, I would say it's convenience. Well, what do you mean by convenience? What I mean is that for years, we've been exporting commodity products. Frozen short plates that is the lowest common denominator. Todd knows very well from his background, into very cheap Yoshinoya type, sliced short plate on a bed of rice. Very big market, but it's commodity. Pork side, sending hams in, and hams are very important, but just sending a regular commodity ham in for further processing. Those are all important markets. But what we're seeing today is going to the next level. I'm going to use Korea as an example. So we're seeing this trend towards convenience, meaning online, overnight delivery, that mixed in with home meal replacement. So the meal kits that you see at Costco or Sam's Club, the meal kits, the shelf space in the U.S. is relatively small, but growing. E-Mart in Korea, the shelf space for HMR is 40 to 50% of the store. So if you have 10 aisles, it's 4 or 5 aisles that's all some sort of convenience type product. Of course, these products cost more, but you're talking about an economy in Korea that price is the 4th or 5th thing down the list. They're interested in options, they're interested in quality, they're interested in convenience, and you combine that with the delivery systems. The way Jihye, our manager in Korea, the way she orders her food, she never goes to the store. She orders what she needs by 9 or 10 p.m. It's waiting out front of her door at 6 a.m. the next morning. Now, I'm not sure that'd work in Denver because it'd be gone at 6 a.m. in the morning, but people don't steal in Korea, so it works. But this is driving business. They're wanting quality, they're willing to pay for it, and this is what I'm talking about with convenience. So 40 to 50% of the sales of grocery in Korea are in this sort of form or fashion. It's way under 10% here. It's way under 10% in Japan. China's starting to see it come on a bit. So this is really an opportunity outside of Korea as well for the future. So convenience, I'll have a few slides in a minute going into a little more detail, but very, very exciting area to add value in the supply chain. China opportunity, it's always a concern, it's always an opportunity. China's a very valid market, as I said earlier. I won't go into that again now, but we'll continue to service China. And just kind of a side note, you don't see any packers investing everything into China. If they have 5 or 6 plants, maybe 1 or 2 supply China. The other ones are supplying the rest of Asia. You know, it's a way of minimizing the risk, right? So it's sort of like dipping your toe in the water, not jumping in full bore. The other thing we should talk about is the food service rebound from COVID. You know, we've been out of COVID in the US now for almost 3 years, 2.5. In the case of Asia, especially China, a year ago, December, was their last emergency declaration being lifted. So they're only out of COVID for 1 year. And they're still, I was just in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago, and I'd say half the people are still wearing masks. Same thing in Japan, maybe 1/3 of the people still wearing masks. So it's very real in their minds. And you know, here and in Mexico and Caribbean, when we got out of COVID, everyone was going to Cancun and, hey, it's over, and food service went through the roof, and it's still doing well. We haven't seen that yet in Asia. So there's a bit of a tailwind potential here. Our former manager, Joel Haggard in Hong Kong, called it revenge spending. We haven't seen the revenge spending in Asia yet. So that's an opportunity going forward, and something we're really focused on, rebounding the food service. And part of that is, as well, is tourism. There was, so let me see, it was July of 2022, post-COVID, I made my first trip back to Japan and Korea since COVID. It required a special visa, no tourism allowed. You had to have an office in the countries, so I was represented as the manager of our office. I had to go see them. I literally felt like I was the only foreigner in Seoul and Tokyo. There's only a few of us there. It's changed now, but that's what you're dealing with. It was very restricted. So now tourism is starting to rebound, not back to normal, but it's well on its way. Okay, diversify and develop markets. More markets are better than less markets. I'll get into that more in a minute. And the other significant thing on the pork side is what's going on in Europe. So what's going on in Europe is, and when I started in the business in the 80s, the gold standard was European pork production. In terms of quality, innovation, they were sort of the leader somewhat on frozen pork into Japan back in the day. You all know what's going on. They don't adopt technology in Europe. In fact, they're anti-technology for the most part. They do not, they're over-regulated, immensely over-regulated. So what you're seeing is with this last spike in inputs from a year ago, when corn went up to $6 to $7 for a while and fertilizer was high, I mean, that hit us here, but it really hit the Europeans. So you have massive liquidation going on. It's been going on for 2 years, but it's really becoming evident now. So your largest competitor for US pork has been European pork for decades. So 2 years ago, production in European Union was down 5%. Last year, it was 6%. Exports 2 years ago, our largest global competitor, exports out of the European Union globally were down 15% 2 years ago, and last year's on track to be down 20%. They're becoming less and less of a factor in the global marketplace. And structurally, with the exception of Spain, who's still expanding, structurally, these are changes that probably will never reverse. So now, Brazil is starting to come on the scenes, replacing some of that, but the US is very well positioned to take up the slack. So the left-hand side is the EU Commission's forecast for pork production in Europe. Steady trend line down to the early 2030s. I would say that's probably conservative. I think it'll go down quicker. And you can see what our USDA forecast is going forward into 2033. So the US is well positioned. I know it's a rough time today, but we're well positioned for the future. All right, this is a slide on the convenience that I talked about, the e-commerce, the home meal replacement, et cetera. This just shows modern grocery retail, the food service, all different segments are seeing increases around convenience, and that should continue, even in places where they really don't know anything about it today. Even Mexico is starting to see demand for convenience. We usually think of Mexico as very price sensitive. I think that's changing. All right, a few slides, historical slides here to give you a little flavor. The right-hand column is 2023. We're up 8%. Of course, we don't have December yet. We're going to end up the year 8 to 9% up on volume. You can see the steady trend line up since 2003. And this is a breakout by market. So it's simply amazing what's going on in Mexico. Look, the green line is 3 years ago on the left-hand side. The red line is 2 years ago, and the gray line is 2023. Mexico has just been a steady trend line up. You're going to see the same thing on beef in a minute. Amazing what's going on there. But you kind of scroll over, you know, pork is down. The light blue bar was 2020, sorry. That was ASF in China. So it's been a steady trend line lower, mainly driven by muscle cuts. Variety meats are still strong. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Japan's down slightly, but look at Canada, look at Korea. Central America up 15%. It's another, just like Mexico, this is another area of the world that we used to think of as being very price sensitive. Hams get over 80 cents a pound, they stop buying. Not the case anymore. Hams go to $1.10 last year, still buying. So it's really, the elasticity of the demand has been amazing. It's no longer, as Mexico and Central America, strictly a price sensitive market. They're looking for value, they're looking for supply chain long term. South America, Australia, New Zealand, you probably can't tell because the scale is small, but on Australia, New Zealand, this is mainly a boneless ham and boneless loin market. You can see almost a total flip from 2022 to 2023. That is us taking all the European share back that was in 2 years ago from Europe into Australia. That's all gone back to the US overnight. Same thing in Taiwan. That's too small to see on the screen, but we're up about 300% on Taiwan. Once again, a lot of that has to do with Europe's situation. So pretty broad-based growth in general. This is, I just did a few interviews this morning, WNAX and some others. It's not just the fact that we're setting a record on value last year. The fact is it's across many markets. It's very diversified. It's a very healthy situation. So this is the value slide. Once again, the right-hand side doesn't show December yet, but we're at 7.4 billion through 11 months. We're going to be 8.2-ish, which will be a new record in 2023. Real quick, I realize this is a pork meeting, but I want to give you a little background on beef. I'm sure a lot of you are involved with beef. Some of you anyway are involved with beef as well, but the story is even a little more amazing. Now we're down 13%, but keep in mind beef production is down 5 to 6%, so that's part of it. But once again, we do have some good stories on the beef side I'll get into in a minute. On the value side, it's down but still strong. We're going to come in at $10 billion this year, which will be the second largest year of exports for beef ever. So last year was a record at 11.4, I think it was. So let's talk about variety meats. When was the last time anyone in here had a pork tongue for dinner? Or a pork stomach? Liver, how about liver? Conley, you've never had liver? This is one of the keys. We don't only export the primal cuts. The 1.3 billion worth of the exports of the 8 billion are variety meats, primarily going to Mexico and China. You know, front feet, hind feet, these are delicacy items in a lot of these countries. So we spend just as much time promoting and doing seminars on the variety meats as we do on the muscle cuts. And it's a growing area. We've seen hind feet and front feet over $1 a pound before. We've seen bungs. I know it's right after lunch, but this is a good detail. It's the end of the large intestine, and the Asians love it for barbecue. We've seen bungs get as high as $3 a pound, whereas it would normally go to rendering. So this is adding value in the supply chain. Very, very real part of the market. Heads, tongues, snoots, cheeks, you know, all of this is being exported for the most part. All right. So a couple of success areas of the world. Now, I'll give pork board a lot of credit, the pork industry a lot of, Gary and others, Sam. 10, 11 years ago, we sat down and started talking about regions that showed promise. As I mentioned earlier, Indonesia, Malaysia today, I think are regions that show a lot of promise. Well, 10 years ago, Colombia and Central America were also two regions that showed a lot of promise. So we get, roughly a quarter of our funding from pork board, and we agreed with the leadership at that time, let's put more emphasis into the Colombias of the world and the Central Americas of the world. Well, look at that payback. You're talking about growth over 12, 13 years, 10 times on the, in the case of Colombia, and in Central America, 3 times. That's pretty, I wish we could find a lot more Colombias and Central Americas, because this is money well spent. And once again, the consumers and the trading folks in these regions used to be totally based on price. Now they want to know about what are the options? How do I merchandise? Hey, boneless loins are too high. What other products can I sub? Well, you could use sirloins, you could use rib ends. They're looking for alternatives. Their first question is not, why is the price so high? The first question is, I can't get enough of this. What else can I use? When you get to that level, you then become where it's less price sensitive. They're more interested in quality. They're more interested in, options on, merchandising or cooking. So this is a good thing. So this is one of my favorite slides, and I give a lot of credit to the pork industry. A sustainability video.
To U.S. producers, less is more. Using 75% less land, 25% less water, 7% less energy, and 8% fewer carbon emissions over the past 6 decades. And we're still finding ways to minimize impact while maximizing our product. But behind the numbers is a bigger story. 60,000 of them, actually. The U.S. pork industry provides farmers with end-to-end certification and compliance programs for workers and operations, while developing a data infrastructure to track individual sustainability data toward our industry-wide goals. Because supporting U.S. pork farmers allows them to run each operation the way they know it should be done. And sustaining farmers ensures a sustained industry and planet going forward. Sustainability hits all the senses. Experience it with U.S. pork.
So I'm sure a lot of you have seen that video before. The pork board, we work closely with the pork board to put this together. We have actually translated it in some of these countries. The single biggest thing that the trade, and I say trade because we're not really to the consumer level in a lot of countries yet. We are in some. The trade wants to know how we produce our products. What do you guys do? For the most part, when you tell, they see the stats like slaughter was 2.5 million head in 1 week. Well, that's more than most of the live production supply in a lot of these countries. So they put their head around what we do is tough for them to do. But something like this that tells our story in such a positive way is just, the key to working in these countries. The other thing that we do, I've got a slide on it later, I think, but taking producers like yourselves, a lot of you, into the markets, meeting the trade. I know the Department of Ag does a lot of this as well. Having producers go in and help us tell the story is the home run ball. They love it. They want to hear from you. They want to put a face with the idea versus, thinking about that we're just factory farmers. This is the perception that some of our competitors paint, is that we're just interested in volume, volume, volume. Well, we do have volume, but we also have safety, quality. We care, we put back into the environment, we're using less water, we're being more efficient. So telling a story like this is the key. So anyway, we are using this and it's quite effective. So this is the slide I was talking about. Every September we have what we call a Heartland team where we'll take, I believe last September, we had about 20 producers that went along with a few of us. We went to Korea and Japan. On the left, Gene Nome, and most of you probably know Gene. And on the right is Randy Sprunk. He's from southwestern Minnesota. He's actually chairman of USMEF this year. And we had the chance to go into the market with pork board reps. Courtney Knupp as well was along from pork board. And going into the market, seeing the market, and helping to tell the story with the trade in Korea and Japan. Extremely effective. If you ever, as producers, have the chance to go, please take advantage of it because it really helps tell the story. So let's talk a little bit about a few of the markets, and stop me if there's any questions. But Mexico, I don't know where we would be this year in the cutout if it wasn't for Mexico. 1 out of every 2 hams produced, 1 out of every 2 hams produced is exported. And most of those, not all, but most go to Mexico. It's just been an incredible relationship with that country. I remember in the 80s with Swift, I'd go down in the 90s, go down into Mexico, and it was a bill-paying mission because they wouldn't pay their bills. It was a very unreliable system. There was a lot of people that walked away from contracts. And today, a lot of what's sold in Mexico is formula basis. I wouldn't say there's no issues with payment, but very few. It's a very efficient, mature, trustworthy market in 40 years. It's taken 40 years to get there, but extremely impressive. And it's not just hams, picnics, butts, the shoulders. It's loins. We had an initiative, the pork loin, most of you, I know Todd's aware of this, there's others, undervalued for the most part in terms of price. Very undervalued. Well, there's 2 large markets for loins. One is retail in the US, like the Costco's of the world. The other one is Japan. The largest single product that goes to Japan is loins. We've got to find other markets for loins. And one of the things we've been working, once again, with pork board support is the loin initiative down in Mexico. We're now 3 years into it, and we're targeting the higher end consumer in Mexico, the upper middle class, let's call it. And we've seen the results. Now the loin is probably the 3rd largest item that goes to Mexico, where it was very little or none 10 years ago. So this is the way markets develop. Once again, it's a similar problem to what you have in the U.S. How do you prepare a loin? Well, you don't cook it to 180 and it tastes like your shoe, right? It's okay to cook it to medium rare and let it sit. And it's, I had a chop last night for dinner here in town. If everyone cooked the chop like Fleming's in West Des Moines, you wouldn't have a problem with loin consumption. but not everyone cooks it that way. And we have the same problem globally. They want to cook the heck out of stuff in Mexico because the older generation's worried about trichinosis. It's very simple, right? So once they taste it and understand, then you get a consumer that's starting to buy a lot of loins, the upper end consumer in Mexico. Promoting the loin in Mexico, as I said, the reason I put this slide in is, see that bottom right picture? One of the ideas our team in Mexico came up with 3-4 years ago is we've got several pork trucks in Mexico. It's literally a van that's been retrofitted with a kitchen, a demonstration area, kitchen, demonstration area, a couple of other things in there. They have a cooler in there, all designed around to do tasting and educational sessions. They'll go around to retailers, they'll go around to distributors, and they'll take the pork truck in. We have one on beef as well. Been very, very well received. That idea was generated during COVID. Because why? They wouldn't allow tasting demos inside the buildings during COVID. Tasting demos usually are the best way to get the product in the consumer's mouth to see just how good it is. So we approached Costco, we approached several of the major retailers during COVID in Mexico and said, hey, what if we bring in a truck and we park it outside? It's outdoors, don't have to worry about COVID. And they loved it. They like it so much, COVID's gone and we still have the trucks. These retailers love it. We're starting to roll it out, the concept out in Central America as well. Malaysia, I just throw this in. If we get continued access on plant registrations, Malaysia has a lot of potential for the U.S. pork industry, and Indonesia even a little bit of potential. Not so much the percentage of Christians, non-Muslim in Indonesia is small, but it's 270 million people in the region. If only 10% are Christian, it's still 27 million people. So it's a lot of opportunity that's untapped. So we're really focused on this going forward. Oh, yeah, I forgot I had this slide in here. Another segment that we work very closely with is convenience stores. This example is Japan. So you're probably thinking convenience stores like Casey's or whatever, where you got the hot dog that goes round and round forever. The convenience stores are much different in Japan. There's 60,000 convenience stores roughly in Japan, and the perishable shelf space is immense. It's probably half the length of the store, and the stores are way bigger than convenience stores here. And they're in lunch boxes. So they'll put like a shaved piece of pork loin on a bed of rice. It could be 4 or 5 ounces. And there's all sorts of different short plates on the beef side. But when there's 60,000 stores and they have 5 or 6 turns a day, you're talking about huge amounts of volume. So Spam, the Hormel folks came to us several years ago, and Spam is extremely popular in Japan, especially with the army forces in Okinawa. And Korea is also big from the Korean War. So Hormel approaches and says, hey, we want to work with Family Mart, who is the second largest convenience store in Japan, 16 or 15,000 stores. We want to do a test run on our Spam Musubi, which is a Japanese version using Spam. And they ran a test in 100 convenience stores. This is 2 years ago. They liked it so much, they then rolled it out to the entire country for Family Mart. So all 15,000 Family Marts in Japan now have Spam Musubi in there. Spam Musubi is produced in Japan, but it's all U.S. pork picnic meat. So I'm sure Dermot's tracked this when picnics started going up a year ago. This had something to do with it, because it's all U.S. pork raw material from the shoulder. So it sounds like a small win. This is a big deal, and I've actually tasted it several times, and it's not too bad. Not a big Spam eater, but this is pretty good. So the ASEAN region is another area. Philippines in particular, Vietnam, we have a little bit of an issue on high duties into Vietnam. If we were to get that solved with what's going on in Europe, another area with big opportunity. So, it was more price sensitive before, but once again, what happened in the last 2 years? Europe is much less competitive. So it's becoming a much more viable market for U.S. pork, and a lot of population down there with a growing middle class. Costco. if I were to pick a retailer that's probably got the strongest relationship globally with the U.S. industry, it's probably got to be Costco. Sam's Club might be a close second. So 100% of the pork in Mexico in the case is U.S. Well, there's 4 depots in Canada, so half of the pork in Canada is U.S. You look at Korea, U.S., and beef and pork, not just pork. Japan's a mixed bag, partly Australian on beef, partly domestic on pork, and partly U.S. beef in Japan. So Japan's it's a kind of a long story. There's a lot of history there. But a lot of these warehouses globally are invested in U.S. pork. So on the right-hand side is a picture of a warehouse in Seoul. So Costco has almost 800 warehouses globally, including the U.S. Can anyone guess what country has the meat case that moves the most meat, beef and pork, in the world? What location? Okay, you cheated, Dermot. Dermot's right. Korea has a number 1 and number 3 store for movement of pork and beef products in the world. So there's huge meat eaters in Korea per capita. And we had a little bit of downtime where beef was out during post-BSE. Beef's now back in virtually 100%, and most of the pork in Korea is also U.S. So a partner like Costco globally is really a key to some of this success. And Costco recently, post-COVID, started implementing a big part of their business into e-commerce in Asia. That was not the case pre-COVID, so that's another aspect that's really driving the business. All right, so as producers, probably the most important slide. Why does this matter? Why do you give a darn about what goes on internationally? I'm not familiar with it. Seems a little bit risky. And that might all be true, but this is why. We're running at a record pace of payback per head due to exports, $63 a head. It's a record pace. Probably will end up 63 or 4 for the year when we get December data. So this is simply a computation of export value divided by the hogs slaughtered. So you can see the steady trend line up, more and more diversification into the export markets. Now this doesn't mean that domestic's not important. In my mind, you need domestic and international hitting at the same time. And what does that do? It drives the cutout higher. And what does that do? Allows more disposable or gross margin to be spent on the live side. Now you can argue doesn't happen quick enough, but in the end, we want to drive that cutout higher. And with my packer background, I'm talking about this with our team all the time about what do we do on individual cuts and individual markets to drive value, because that's the way to get more money in the supply chain. So I don't see any reason with the world population growing why the potential continues to grow with it, in my opinion. So this breaks that down at $63 a head down by market. Probably no surprise that Japan, Mexico, and China are the 3 biggest. The Mexico number is absorbently high. It's usually more like $10 a head, but the last couple of years it's grown. And that's that product mix. We've always sold hams to Mexico, but we haven't always sold loins and shoulders and these other products. Ribs, another item that goes down there. So that's a good thing. China, Hong Kong, $10 a head. Canada, 7. Korea, 4, or almost 5. But that light blue, the $12 a head in the light blue, this is the part of the pie that's growing. This is the Philippines. This is the Malaysias. This is the other parts of the world. That part of the pie is growing and will continue to grow, in my opinion. And this is an area we have to keep our eyes on. Another part of the world that I haven't talked about that I'm getting to is Africa. That hasn't contributed much yet, but in the future, I think it will. So let's talk about Africa. So we started investing more money in Africa, not a lot of money, more time than money. In 2015, I actually made several trips to Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, with another colleague in Europe, and we were handling Africa for several years. So I'll give you just an example. Lagos, Nigeria, the town of, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 30 million people, nobody knows. Huge population base. To me, Lagos, Nigeria looks a lot like Mexico City did in the 1980s. This broad, huge, very young population with a lot of spending power. Now, it's not equitable spending power. There's a few that have a lot and a lot that don't have much. But that's how these markets start. There's air shipments of product going in, like a half a ton here, a half a ton there of U.S. beef going into food service today. Very, very small amounts. There's a lot of variety meats, pork and beef, mainly beef because of access issues on pork, but when we'll get beyond those eventually. Pork to me is actually a bigger opportunity than beef. We just haven't seen the results yet. So my point is that when you have the youngest, this is the youngest demographic in the world. I think the numbers I saw said that the average age in Nigeria today is 19 years old, and in 2030 the average age will be 28. Well, that means that you've got this evolution with, as they get into the spending power years with a growing middle class, they're going to want higher quality products. And like I said, there's already U.S. beef going in by air to places like Ghana. And that's how it starts. So there's a lot of, now, it's not going to be easy. Dermot knows better than anyone. I mean, these places are extremely crime-ridden, corrupt, can't trust them. Well, we said that about Mexico 40 years ago, and Mexico's pretty darn reliable today. This is how these businesses start. You're going to have you have a population today of 1.5 billion in continental Africa. Pick a date, 2035, it'll be 2 billion, or maybe 2040. So long after Pat's tired of hearing me come and talk to you, whoever is after me is going to be talking a lot about Africa, I'll guarantee you. So just keep it on your radar. We have a lot of access work to do. MPPC's got it right at the top of their list to get reasonable access. If we got access on pork carts into South Africa today, that would be 50 loads a month that could happen overnight. We just don't have access. That one deals with the classification as a, who asked that? I didn't see who. Oh, there you go. Here, I'm looking around wondering. Yeah, they have preferred and unpreferred categories, and pork variety meats fall in the unpreferred, so thus they would come in at a very high duty. So, but MPPC, it's political, you know, as most things are on access when you're looking at Africa. But you know, they're going to figure it out that today, a lot of their products are smuggled into Nigeria, for example, through Ghana, through Benin, throughout. They're going to figure it out that if they do things the right way, what happens to their cost? It goes down. It'll happen. It just takes time. Mexico was the same way for years. So I'm simplifying it. I just want to make a point that there's a lot of opportunity, and Matt's going to be hiring a French-speaking person for West Africa this year, probably based in Ghana, and we're going to be hiring a Portuguese-speaking person in Angola, you know, just to get, like I said, it doesn't cost a lot of money because we're not, modern retail is such a small part of the market in Africa that you can do a lot with a little money, and that's what we're trying to do. Doesn't show a lot of results today, but I'll guarantee you tomorrow it will. So one of the things that Matt did that was really cool, Matt comes from the exporter sector. The second or third week on a job, he calls me, he says, Dan, I want to lease a chef's room. I said, what? So he leased a room, he retrofitted it with a kitchen, cooking, barbecue, and you can't see it in that picture, but on the other side are tables where we host customers. We host USDA, we host South Africa. This is in Durban, South Africa. And his whole theory is he carries an inventory of U.S. beef products and pork when we have the access, and he brings in guests because eating it and tasting it is 99% of the sales job. They just don't know what they don't know. They don't know U.S. grain-fed high-quality beef. They don't even know, you know, the pork quality, you know, because what they have is usually, well, Indian buffalo meat, for example, you can't find a crock pot efficient enough to make that stuff tender, 8-year-old, 9-year-old buffalo. But they call it beef. That's what they're used to. So anyway, this is a huge opportunity of education, telling our story, and something we're really focused on. So this is our forecast for next year. We see on the beef side, even though beef production will be down again next year, we see it kind of the slowdown on the export side moderating, maybe just down slightly next year, call it 2%. On pork, we're at 3% growth. I have this ongoing argument with our economists. I'm a marketing guy, so I'm always rounding up. The economists are always rounding down, Dermot. But we'll be growing next year, and I think next year will be another record. There's a lot of good momentum started in 2023. So with that, I'm happy to take any more questions because I'm sure I didn't explain it all that well. Yes, Conley. Yeah, what are the consumer habits and how are they changing in the world? Well, one was the convenience. We see much more demand for higher, for products that are more convenient, more sophisticated, more options, even if they're more expensive, it's a trend. It depends on the country. Most of these countries, the per capita consumption of beef and pork is maybe 20% of what ours is, or lower. So that's a good point, Conley. I didn't mention that. The point is that protein is not a mainstay in a lot of their diets. So as they get more familiar with imported protein, that's very tasty, very nutritious, they get to learn about it, it'll grow per capita consumption in these countries, which means more opportunity for imports. Most of these countries don't have the grain. Most of them don't have the expertise to produce on their own. Now, domestic production will increase, but not enough to handle the demand. So those are the trends we're seeing is slowly, Colombia is a good example. Per capita consumption's gone up it's almost doubled in 10 years from a very low base. This is part of the success because it'll be self-perpetuating for more demand for imported product. Yes, sir. Actually, legally, that doesn't happen. Not with Mexico and Canada. Now, Vietnam and China is another story. There is some of that pass through Hong Kong. But even in China and Hong Kong, they've cracked down. There's a lot of people who have gone to prison that got caught smuggling. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's much less than it used to be. But I think for the most part, the NAFTA or USMCA countries, if there's any of that, it's very small. Why? Yeah, why is that illegal? Well, unless you're further processing it into a sausage or something, it's about country of origin. It's about, stating what really is in the product. I was envisioning that it would be further processed, I guess. Yep. Is that a separate category? That's a separate category, right. And is that helpful in understanding those markets like Mexico and like hams further processed in Mexico and then marketed? Yeah. But I think that most of the raw material that comes in from the U.S. is consumed domestically. But then they have this TIF, I forget what that acronym stands for, but it's like a USDA special approval for export. And these TIF plants, generally, they buy a little bit of imported product. Generally, they're buying domestic product and using that for export. And they're seeing growth in their markets to places like Japan and Korea as well. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir. It varies by market. Generally, we use that everywhere, but sometimes wording matters. In Vietnam, they use delicious, and the translation might vary slightly, but the overall idea is safety, nutritious, tastes good. depending on the culture and what's appropriate, it might vary a bit, but the general overlying theme is consistent. We, they do. Now it varies. So there's a lot. Pork's still an ingredient in a lot of countries where, like Canada, for example, takes a lot of loins and a lot of picnics for further processing. The Canadians don't do that so much, and he really, unless you know what you're looking at with the establishment number on the bag, the VAC bag, it's not promoted as U.S. pork in Canada. That's just a. It's not that. I mean, U.S. Our safety standards are similar, right? So to replace one for the other, we're probably doing. We don't do very little promotion in Canada for that reason, but it's still good for our industry because the quality perception of Canada is very good as well. So, but most countries we do that because it's a differentiating point. Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, it's a selling point. Yep. Yeah, Sam.
I noticed on that chart on Mexico how much it went up. Is the Mexican pork producers cutting back, or are they eating more pork in Mexico? Or why is that?
Yeah, per capita consumption's going up slightly. But trade's increasing as well. So one advantage that Mexico has is they have, for the most part, ample labor. So they can do more diced and sliced and yakitori type things that are too labor intensive for the most part to do here. So it's a niche, but it's a niche that they're taking advantage of. So if you add that in with slight increase in per capita consumption, consequently they're a much bigger player than they were not too long ago. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything that's contributing to it. Yep. Yes?
You talked about Brazil as a competitor.
Yeah. Brazil. Yeah, they're coming on strong. The replacing EU is our #1 competitor, at least in the future. On paper, they don't show up like that yet, but they will. And there's a lot of potential for space. They have a lot of acreage for corn to increase pork production and beef for that matter. So yeah, it's very something we have to watch very closely. Yeah, yeah. The one thing that is happening with Mexico that's a bit of a concern is the AMLO administration has taken on this inflation-fighting policy to allow countries that don't have free trade agreements to come in at zero duty, and Brazil's one of them. Which, at the level of government-to-government talks, this is high on our list. Like we have a USMCA. What are you doing over here? Well, it's to fight inflation, which I think economists, for the most part, would argue whether or not it really fights inflation. But if they were to have to pay the normalized duty without a free trade agreement, it would make them less competitive. So we'll see where that all ends up. But you're right. We need to watch Brazil globally, especially into Southeast Asia, these more price-sensitive markets that Europe used to control. We need to watch them. Yeah. Any other questions? No questions, Brad? Okay, I knew it. Around sustainability. Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on the market, but even our big markets, the established markets like a Japan, they're all interested in it, but nobody knows what it means, you know? So there's no requirements today around sustainability, but as we all know, it's probably a matter of time before a McDonald's or, you pick the big retailer, Costco, whoever, implements something, right? So we see that as an opportunity today to tell our story, as I said, like that video. I mean, they just absolutely love it. And the ones that are very well-informed, the trading partners that are well-informed, Costco would fall in this group, they know. So it's a matter of how do we help them tell the story to their consumers. And as you all know, being U.S. consumers, it's tough enough to tell the U.S. consumer. Imagine when you different cultures, different languages, it's even that much harder to tell it to a Korean or a Japanese. Is it on their radar today? Generally, no. The fact that we go through this with them and show it and they understand it, they love it. Now, some of the more emerging markets like Africa, it's not, they just need to eat, right? So that's the spectrum, but it's all headed that way over time, I think. Yeah, good question. One more, yes.
Would you say that there was kind of a rumor, people were saying that China was eating through their herd because of ASF and it was dwindling, they're not being able to replace it as fast as they're having to kill. Is there any truth to that? And if there is, where's the end?
You're talking about the pig herd?
Yeah.
About,
In China.
yeah. Well, actually, yeah, I just returned from Hong Kong where we met with some of these folks. The current situation in China on the herd is that it's excessive. They've rebuilt too far. Now it's not bigger than it was pre-COVID, but what's changed since COVID is consumption is off. Well, you can't trust the data, but everyone you talk to, it's off. Is it off 10%, 20%? Nobody knows, but it's off, right? So I think it's more of a consumption problem than a herd problem. That being said, herd health issues, they're permanent, they're endemic. ASF, FMD, they're all endemic in China. So it's the degree to which they have these issues, right? And once again, you'll never know exactly. But definitely consumption is down. That's what our office says, talking to people every day. We have offices in Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong.
How much liquidation is going on in China?
They've had, yeah. The problem with China is that you have so much government backing, it's hard to tell how much they've been subsidized. There's been some liquidation, there's been some herd problems, as you said, but they've got a bigger problem is that the consumption is off and poultry consumption is up. So they're in a bit of a dilemma, and which probably will lead to more liquidation because they're losing big money. Yeah. But keep in mind, it's the largest consumer of pork in the world still. So it could turn on a dime. That's what happened in 2020 with ASF. In 2019, they started seeing this. Next thing you know, they're massively short. The last thing the Chinese government wants is shortages of food because that's the Xi's controlling point. If they have people riding in the streets because they don't have enough rice or enough pork, pork's culturally one of their sensitive top 20 food products, that would be a big problem. They had that in 2020, and you saw what happened, with demand globally in 2020 for imports. They couldn't get it fast enough. So we just have to keep an eye on it. I can't answer all your questions because the data out of there is just so unreliable. Yeah.
Is there a big price difference between poultry and pork over there?
Yeah, it's similar to here. And then, these misperceptions about poultry being more healthy than pork, this is something that we're working on,